So if I could please get you to give your name and what it is that you do.
I'm D.L. Henderson, and I'm a volunteer here at the Historic Oakland Cemetery. I'm also on the board of directors, and I do special projects like African American restoration. I'm involved in that. I do history and research for the foundation in a lot of different areas: art and architecture, death and dying, that is mortality and morbidity, and women's history too. So lots of different things I work on here.
Okay. Do you have any history or experience in funeral service or mortuary science?
No. I've thought about going to mortuary school, but no, I don't have any expertise in that.
Okay. So what are you doing here today, Ms. D.L.?
Today we're celebrating Juneteenth. Something I've wanted to do for a few years. We started it last year with a small program and hoping to grow it year by year. It's especially important, I think, to celebrate freedom, because that's what today is about, celebrating freedom from slavery. And it's also an important time for us to start sharing more of our African American history, because we are in the middle of this restoration project, this restoration of the historic African American burial ground.
For those who don't know, what is Juneteenth?
Oh, okay. I would say Google it, but here's my version of Juneteenth. It started off, I think it was Galveston, Texas, where it was the Emancipation Proclamation was read in 1865, following the end of the Civil War, as opposed to January 1863. And the delay, so they celebrated later, I would say. So it's supposed to be the first celebration of emancipation. However, the Emancipation Proclamation, we know, was issued in January 1863. The reason it wasn't read in Galveston was because Galveston Island, that area, was being held by Confederate forces. So, of course, they're not going to read any proclamation from President Lincoln. So that was the delay in the proclamation. There was a myth for many, many years that the enslaved people in that area around Galveston didn't actually know about the Emancipation Proclamation, but it was sort of an isolated event that it didn't get posted in the newspapers locally, but it was all around. Within like a 25, 50-mile radius, other towns knew about it. So I'm sure they did. And
okay, so would you please give a brief history of Historic Oakland, and particularly the African American section of the cemetery?
Oakland Cemetery opened in 1850. It was the second cemetery that was opened by the city of Atlanta. The first one was pretty small. It was in the middle of downtown, or what we call downtown today. And the city was expanding, so to give the city room to expand, they decided to move the cemetery, to close that cemetery and open one that was further outside the city limits. And so this is about a mile from downtown right now. So they weren't expecting that the city limits would again engulf the cemetery, but that's what's happened, of course, today. It was 6 acres when it first opened in 1850, and we don't have records for the cemetery until 1853. So the first burial was fall of 1850, and then for about another year there weren't any records kept, as far as we know, or either they've been lost. But January 1853, we have a record of the first African American who was buried here, and that's the record of the first. I'm sure there were probably African Americans buried here in the time before that. But it's a great place to study mortality and morbidity, because these are the only death records available for the city of Atlanta that early. So we do, so the sexton at the cemetery, the guy who managed the cemetery for the city, started keeping records of who's buried here. So they kept records of age, where people were from, and also cause of death for many, many years as well. So the first area where African Americans were buried was a segregated section that opened in 1853 called Slave Square. And that area was soon surrounded over the years as the cemetery expanded. It became surrounded by the rest of the cemetery. That is, it was the middle of the cemetery, because it had expanded to 48 acres by 1867. So in 1877, Slave Square was dug up. That is, the bones and bodies of 800 plus people who were buried there, African American men, women, and children, were removed and moved to the colored pauper grounds. And so that area then was cleaned up and sold to whites. So today we have a marker at that area, just so people know that that is still Slave Square. To me, it is still Slave Square. That's African American history. It's sacred ground here at Oakland for African American history because that's where we had an African American burial ground. Today, we'll be doing tours of the 1866 African American historic burial ground. That is, in 1866, following the Civil War, the city of Atlanta set aside a section for African Americans to buy burial lots. It was the only place in the cemetery where they could purchase lots for their burial, and so they buried in that section. So our records show that over 12,000 African Americans have been buried here since the record keeping started in 1853. And the section is still used today. There are still some burials throughout the cemetery as well. We have 10 to 12 burials per year, and we have scattered burials in the African American grounds. So some families are still using theirs. The most recent burial, I think, was 2014 in the African American grounds.
Now, are those individuals of prestige, or are they just people who have had family members buried here who have purchased property in the past? How does that work?
Sure. Some of the burials are new purchases. That is, families, as they've died out or passed on, there might be one or two burial spots left, or there may be a lot that wasn't used, and those individuals will sell. This is a city park. We're part of the Parks and Recreation Department, so the city takes care of the roadways and the general areas in the cemetery. But these are private lots that people own, and so occasionally they will sell them and we'll get new burials that way. But also we have people who are still being buried in their family lots. That is, over the years there might be some spaces left and people choose to be buried here with their ancestors. We also have more cremains now. We have cremated remains. And I think you can fit up to 3 in a grave site in the ground. So some people are opting to use the sites that their families have used for many years, the burial sites, because they can also then use cremains. They can put cremains in those spaces and make good use of them as well. And some people just like the history. So we do have people who are looking for somewhere historic to be buried. So it's a very attractive place for people today as well.
Okay. Now, before we started recording, you were talking about the history of African Americans not necessarily marking the graves. Could you go into that and
Sure.
why marking graves or not marking graves may be a part of our culture?
Okay. One of the things we're doing with the restoration is trying to, we're not restoring it to new. That's not the point. The point is to do the research and try to figure out what something looked like in the past and then recover that part of the history. So one thing we've been talking about, we did a ground penetrating radar study last year, and it was, the result of the study was 800 plus burials were identified, or probable burials were identified, and the company that we used put little flags down. So people were really impressed by the fact that you've got 800 plus flags, little flags down there, where they thought there was nothing. Well, our burial records actually cover a lot of that ground, literally, and so we do know that there are burials in places that aren't marked. So we've been having a discussion about how to identify unmarked burials. So historically we know that many African Americans, I won't say all, but many African Americans marked graves with field stones. That history is in my own family, of marking graves with field stones. Planting a shrub goes across numerous cultures, of planting a tree or a shrub where the person died. So that's part of the tradition as well. And then also there's another tradition of what's called grave goods or grave decoration, where, and that is in several cultures, but also in West Africa, where you might have personal items left on the grave. And that's something that's easy to see. So that's one of the traditions that has been noted by historians in the United States of the graves, especially from the 19th and early 20th century, in African American cemeteries that are marked with personal items, or shells, or glass bottles, clocks with the hand stopped supposedly at the time of death, which actually relates to a Victorian custom. Something called memory jars. I call them memory jars, but jars were placed on graves with personal items in them, including photographs. And that was something that was done here at Oakland. We know of from someone who recorded that back in the late 19th century. So, but these are all ephemeral, that is, things that don't last. So the shrubs may have died out or been uprooted for whatever reason. Fieldstones get moved. There were also probably wooden markers as well, and the wooden markers deteriorate. And so we don't have those kinds of things still on the grounds anymore. But many of the graves probably were never marked, because not every culture has a grave marking tradition. And not all African cultures had a grave marking tradition. So we don't really know that all the graves were ever marked in some way at all, though we know there were probably some things that were in the landscape that are no longer there. So we've been talking about how to represent those things, and even if we should try to go back and represent something when we don't actually know what it was.
Just to wrap things up, after all of your research and all the history that you've obviously accumulated over the years, how do you want to be remembered, and have you put things in place for your arrangements?
Well, in general, yes. One thing I've done as a genealogist, we're always challenging ourselves to record our own histories so that our descendants won't have as much trouble, the next generations won't have as much trouble finding out about us. Not the documents, not the things that are recorded for everyone, but those personal stories that no one will know but us if we don't share them. So I have written my obituary already, and so that's in place. As far as the other details, I'll leave that to the people who are here, because cemeteries are for the living. And so all those burial traditions and rites and customs are things that the living engage in, and they're important to the living. So I'll let the living that I leave behind decide